Hello, this is the Dreadweaver. Prepare yourself for an evening of true terrifying tales that will weave webs of terror in the darkest corners of your mind. If you're a fan of stories of mystery, true crime, paranormal, or anything that crawls in the shadows just beyond our sight, you've found the right place. This week, we have 5 new, true frightening tales to share with you, as well as a few of our favorites from previous episodes. If you have a story to share, be sure to reach out via the details listed in the description. If you like what you hear, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to turn on notifications. All of these actions tell YouTube you want to hear more from us. And with that, let us delve into the darkness. The Mimic in the Woods. Okay, so a little bit of backstory. I live in a very small rural community in the Pacific Northwestern tip of the United States. My town is surrounded by miles and miles of woods, and there are several small native reservations nearby. My family picks and sells mushrooms for a living when they're in season, so we all spend a pretty huge chunk of our days out in the woods, sometimes even after dark, with the help of headlamps and flashlights. There's kind of an unspoken but widely known phenomenon locally that there is some sort of entity, for lack of better words, that roams through the woods starting around dusk and lingers throughout the night, which isn't spoken of often. My mom and stepdad have seen these things beforehand, both in the area I saw it tonight and in another location approximately 20 or so miles on the opposite outskirts of town. Tonight, I had my first occurrence. This is what happened. It had become dark in the woods quick, and our mushrooming group each had small LED lights. Not too bright, but just enough to see about 2 feet or so ahead of you. I had randomly started to become uneasy and feel like something was off. The forest had become very quiet. I would hear a small branch crackle nearby, randomly, every now and then for about 10 to 15 minutes, to which I chalked off as possibly being a cougar, until I saw one of our other lights, maybe 25 to 30 foot or so to my left. I was instantly relieved and kept picking like normal, knowing it was either my mom or her buddy nearby, and that I was safe at that point. About every few minutes, I'd look up and see the light flash again. One to the left, and then caught sight of another ahead of me shortly after, to which I'd assumed was my mom. I started following the lights, since we like to stay somewhat nearby each other, but not close enough to where we're stealing mushrooms from one another's patch, and feeling quite safe again. Eventually, I heard a man and woman talking, and the woman's voice sounded exactly like my mom, but it was far enough that I couldn't quite make out what they were saying. I felt safe, to say the least, knowing I wasn't out there alone, since it was getting very dark at this point in time, and I was about ready to head back to the car. Eventually, I made my way further to the left, and had stopped going deeper into the woods, where I heard and saw their lights, when I ran into the second friend we'd brought with us. There were 4 of us total, and followed him back to the car out of the woods. When we got back to the car, my mom and the first friend were already there, and had been out of the woods for at least half an hour. I have no idea what I was following in those woods, but they mimicked our lights and sounded exactly like my mom and friends' voices. They were leading me deeper and deeper into the woods by myself. I tell my story to everyone in the car as we're driving off, and learn that 2/3 of the other occupants have seen these exact same lights and voices in that same thick wooded area. There was no one else around for miles. Has anyone experienced anything similar to this phenomenon? And does anyone know what in the hell it could possibly be? The more I think about it, the scarier it gets. Whatever these things were, they knew I was alone. They knew nobody was nearby or close enough to see or hear them other than me. They were luring me deeper into the dark, thick woods. They mimic the voices of people in your group to confuse and disorient you and try to single you out away from your group. I have so many questions and I am so freaked out. The spider. This isn't necessarily a scary story, but it was an odd coincidence that freaked me out as a kid. My siblings and I grew up in a home that was almost certainly inhabited by something not quite of this world. There were a lot of spooky things that went on in that house. Creepy shadow figures, hearing our names being called when no one was there. But those are stories for another time. This does, however, set the background for the eerie feeling we had as we sat together in the playroom. We spent most of our free time playing very imaginative games, as all children do. We had a playroom set up for the three of us in a central area of the house, but on this day we were playing in my room to keep the noise down while our younger sister napped. I somehow convinced my younger brother to play Barbies with me. I don't recall how we got onto the subject, but it had something to do with feeling a little unsettled by how eerily quiet the house got during nap time. We began to talk about other things we thought were scary and settled on the subject of spiders. We talked about everything that scared us about spiders, from having too many eyes to the way their legs moved as they crawled about. After about 5 minutes of this discussion, we both agreed to change the subject, as it was starting to freak us out a little too much. The room got quiet for a minute, and though we wanted to change the subject, neither of us could stop thinking about spiders. A moment later, my brother said, "Wouldn't it be so scary if a spider just crawled out from under your bed right now?" I agreed, and we both laughed because it was a ridiculous thought. What were the chances of that happening right after having that discussion? Not to mention, we had just made a garage for my dolls under the bed, and there had been no spiders. We moved on with our game, setting up a restaurant for the dolls to visit, and of course for my brother's action figures to come in and destroy. We were setting up the final details, putting dolls at tables and setting food in front of them. I was picking a dress for my doll, and my brother was loading his action figures into their truck so they could drive to the restaurant. "Are they ready yet?" I asked. "Almost," he said, reaching for the last action figure that was lying on the ground next to my bed. As he reached over, we both looked toward the remaining action figure. At that moment, a huge wolf spider crawled out from underneath my bed, right between the two of us. We both screamed and went running out of the room, calling for my mom to come get the spider. So much for being quiet during nap time. The subject came up during playtime a few days later, but we quickly changed the path of conversation. We were convinced that if we talked too much about spiders, another would appear just as the last one had. We never had an in-depth conversation about something that scared us again. It was the creepiest coincidence I've ever experienced. The man in the hallway. When I was in 7th grade, I lived in a neighborhood with a cemetery just outside of it. Most of the streets were named after people in the cemetery. I slept with my mom up until I was around 13, because I would quite often wake up in the middle of the night and see ghostly apparitions. My mom would never acknowledge that she saw it too, so I would just go back to bed thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. I must add that this would happen in multiple homes I lived in Fairview Heights, Illinois. We would move often. We lived in about 4 different homes up until my 8th grade year, when we moved into the home my mom still stays in today. In this particular home we stayed in when I was in 7th grade, I remember waking up, seeing an older white man dressed in a black suit and a hat. He was standing in the doorway to the bathroom in her room. He put me in a mindset of Abraham Lincoln. I tapped my mom to see if she saw it too, and like always, she said no, and I went back to bed. My dad was in a rehab facility at the time I had that experience, and I never spoke on it again. My dad finally came home from rehab and came to live with us. I remember playing my Xbox one day. I was playing the Pimp My Ride video game. Mind you, this was like 2006 to 2007. My dad called me out of the room I was playing in to come to him. He asked me if I just walked past the door. I told him I didn't. He asked again in a tone like he thought I was lying to him. So knowing what I experienced, I asked him if he saw a white man. We are black. He got super quiet, just looking at me like he couldn't believe what I just said. I remember he called somebody and explained what he saw, and he described the exact same person I saw months earlier in my mom's bedroom, standing in her bathroom doorway. He specifically told his friend, the motherfucker was dressed like Dracula. He was a funny man. I remember him going through the entire house, holding the Bible, rebuking what he saw in the name of Jesus. I never saw an apparition again in that house after that, but I'll never forget that shared experience I had with my dad, because it validated that my eyes were not just playing tricks on me. I am now 31 years old, and I still think about that house to this day. The Man in the Fog by Guddy-with-a-hoddie. I never post anything on Reddit, but I have to share this story because it really affected me as a child. When I was about 12 or 13, I used to play a lot of video games with my best friend, and we often played shooters together. As you can imagine, it's easy to get frustrated, and at one point I ended up breaking my PlayStation controller. Since I didn't have a spare and couldn't continue playing, I told my friend that I had to stop. He said I could come over and borrow his second controller, since he didn't live far away, just a short walk. I thought, okay, and told him I'd be over soon. So I grabbed my keys and started walking to his house. It was already dark, and since it was winter, it was snowing and very foggy. While walking, I had a strange feeling, like I was being watched. I kept looking around, but didn't see anyone. When I arrived at his place and picked up the controller, I saw through a window that a man was standing in the middle of the street. I pointed it out to my friend, and we both wondered who or what was standing there. It looked like a person, but we couldn't make out any details, just a silhouette. Eventually, we decided to go outside and see if the person needed help or if something was wrong. We stepped out and asked what was going on, but there was no response. The person just stared at us and then walked away. We were both confused and told his parents, but they brushed it off, thinking we were imagining things because we play too many video games. After a while, I figured it was time to head home. Since we had played video games together for a while, I almost forgot about the strange encounter. But when I was walking back, I started to feel that same eerie sensation of being watched. I saw a few passerby, but they all seemed normal, nothing strange. But just before I got home, I looked behind me one last time, and I saw that person again, this time standing behind a tree, staring at me. Then they started walking toward me, and eventually they began running. I could tell it was an older man, probably around 60. But I was surprised at how fast he was running. He was shouting something in a language I didn't understand, and he didn't seem happy. I ran for my life, clutching my keys, and tried to unlock my front door as fast as possible. When I got inside, I quickly glanced back, but the man was gone. I rushed to my room and immediately told my friend about what had just happened. He suggested I call the police, which I did. But since my description wasn't very detailed, the police took a report, but didn't seem to take it too seriously. My parents were visibly shocked, but nothing ever came of it. In my village, 4 other people reported similar experiences, saying that someone was watching or following them. I was one of them, but no one was ever caught. To this day, no one knows who this man is, whether he's just trying to scare people or if it's something more sinister. No one knows for sure, but everyone agrees that it seems to be a man around 60 years old. Beyond that, no one can give a detailed description. That day, I feared for my life. I've told many of my friends about this, and I've received mixed reactions. Some said it sounds like a spooky campfire story, while others believed me and were visibly scared. A few even told me they had experienced the exact same thing. A Missing Child Reappeared by SameFly5110. This is an old story, but it still trips me out to think about. So I'd say like 5-ish years ago, I was babysitting my cousin's son. He was around 10 at the time. My cousin lives in a condo complex in our hometown that's super small and kid-friendly. Her son asked if he could go outside while I was watching him and his 2 younger siblings, who were about 7 and a newborn at the time. The oldest is really good at listening to instructions, and he is a good kid. I took note of what he was wearing because I told him to change into appropriate play clothes. I told him that he could only play in the courtyard where I could see him from the window. Eventually, his mom came home and asked where he was. I told her I let him play in the courtyard. He was not there anymore. At all. We started searching and yelling for him. Neighbors and other family members that lived nearby came to help out. Police came and searched inside her condo and in his room. As they were about to make the call to start a literal search around town, while we were all talking in the courtyard, he walked out of the condo, out the front door, and wearing an entirely different outfit than what he left to play in. The cop was confused because he also searched in the condo. He literally went back in to make sure there were no secret tunnels, in his words, because it just made no sense. I asked my cousin's son what happened and where he had been, and he said, "I laid down under that tree," and he pointed to a nearby tree in the courtyard. "And then I fell asleep, and then I saw a bright light, and I woke up in my bedroom." So weird. I think about it often. The Fofi. Deep in the forests of the Congo, there is rumored to live a mysterious creature that has terrorized natives for generations. This creature is so large, so sneaky, and so horrifying that inhabitants of the area design their homes and villages to keep the creature at bay. It sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, but locals insist it is entirely real and can recount many tales of sightings and interactions with this creature. It is called the Fofi, better known as the Congolese giant spider. Baka elders recount tales of these giant creatures and warn outsiders of their presence. The Fofi is said to be a large brown spider covered in hair with a leg span of up to 6 feet across. It lays eggs the size and shape of peanuts, producing yellow juveniles with purple abdomens. Their color fades as they grow, slowly morphing into what resembles a giant tarantula. These spiders are said to be highly venomous, building webs above their underground burrows and striking quickly when prey enters their webs, behavior that mimics the trapdoor spider. While they are rumored to feast mainly on antelopes and other jungle animals similar in size, Villagers have plenty of stories of children and pets falling victim to these giant arachnids. Special precautions are taken by locals venturing out into the jungle, as those who have inadvertently wandered into their webs have been devoured. While dealing with these spiders is a way of life for locals, these tales were largely unknown by the outside world until 1938, when explorers Reginald and Marguerite Lloyd encountered the Fofi while traveling along a path in the Congolese jungle. They claimed they were driving along the path when a large jungle creature suddenly darted out in front of them. At first, they thought it was a monkey, as they were accustomed to seeing on their travels. They were stunned, however, when what appeared before them was a tarantula-like spider with a 3 to 4 foot leg span. The spider continued across the path and off into the trees before they could capture a photo. Since then, many others have reported their own sightings, and not just in the jungles of Congo. Reports of giant spiders like these have been documented all around the globe, with high numbers being reported in other jungles in areas of South America and Vietnam. While it's highly probable that there are many undiscovered species hiding out in jungle areas, scientists believe that it's impossible for a spider of this size to exist. The exoskeleton of a spider that size would have to be extremely thick to support its weight, leaving little room for necessary internal organs. The biggest reason scientists believe this to be impossible is the way insects' respiratory systems are structured. Insects breathe via a number of trachea tubes spanning their bodies that diffuse oxygen from the air around them. With a respiratory system like that, a spider of the reputed size would not be able to diffuse enough oxygen from the surrounding air to sustain life. Cryptozoologists argue that there are anomalies to this rule, however, and evolution has resulted in strange creatures that theoretically should not be able to exist. A frequent example cited by cryptozoologists is the coconut crab, who evolved a unique respiratory system over many generations that allowed it to adapt to life on land. They believe it is entirely possible that large arachnids may have evolved in a similar fashion. So what is the truth? Despite nearly 100 years of sightings, scientists have yet to find the Fofi or any conclusive proof of its existence. Cryptozoologists hope a specimen can be found and studied, but unfortunately, time may be running out. Locals state that the large arachnids used to be plentiful, but deforestation has caused the population to dwindle. Until a discovery is made, the Fofi will remain nothing more than a tale pulled straight from our worst nightmares. My Visit to a Weird Vanishing House by The Thing in the Woods. I'm not really sure how else to succinctly describe this experience, or if this is even the right place for it. I've been sitting on it since the summer of 2012, only having mentioned it to a few people. I guess I'm writing this partly to finally put it out there, and to also see if anyone else has had similar experiences or an explanation of what might have happened. To start, here's some context. In 2012, I was living in a coastal area of the northeastern U.S., working for an agency that mostly monitored and enforced environmental compliance. I'd prefer to keep the state and agency secret since I'm not sure the legality of talking about this. However, they issued building permits for structures and work being done alongside protected wetland habitat. Usually these were things like piers, docks, bulkheads, etc. What my job entailed was visiting these properties with a copy of the blueprint included with the permit application, then taking measurements, and sometimes photos, and comparing them to the blueprint to ensure that the applicant did only the work they said they were going to do, and nothing more. On this particular day, I had a few sites to visit, and one of them was to check on a dock that was supposedly being built in a backyard, extending through a salt marsh and into the bay. This all took place in a fairly well-to-do area with a lot of old money and a lot of houses that would nauseate me to find out how much they were worth. If you're picturing a neighborhood of very spaced out, very large houses with immaculate landscaping and waterfront views, you have the right idea. What set this house apart from all the others, even as I parked on the street, was how utterly wrong this place looked for where it was located. It was situated at the inside corner of 2 streets, with another house on either side of it, and it looked utterly incomparable to its neighbors, which were both very large, very new-looking houses, as I previously described. This one was a derelict-looking 2-story building that looked like it was awaiting foreclosure. It had rotted wooden siding, a roof that was falling apart, and a lawn that looked like it hadn't been mowed all summer. In fact, the only thing that didn't look ancient and unkempt was the white picket fence, which was pristine as though it had been painted earlier that week. I double and triple checked the address in the blueprint, finding that while I had the right address, the house looked nothing like how it did in the blueprint, appearing to be a different shape. After confirming that the adjacent houses were also the right addresses, I approached the front door, only to find the storm door wide open and the screen door closed but torn in several places. Now, while my job did not require me to make site visits while the owner was there, or even inform them that I was arriving, I still always tried the front door first, so that the owners didn't think I was just some stranger skulking around their yard. I knocked and rang the doorbell a few times, confused by the fact that nobody was answering, since someone surely had to be home if the door was hanging open. After waiting a bit, I decided that the people living there might have been in their backyard, and that I would let them know I was there when I went around back. The only problem was that there was no way to go around back. The immaculate white fence, which was probably a good 6 foot tall at the shortest, did not appear to have any gate, connecting seamlessly to the fences belonging to the 2 neighbors. While this struck me as odd, it was nothing I hadn't run into before. Some people didn't have gates and would begrudgingly let me in through their front door to access their yard. But still not expecting anyone to answer, I tried my hardest to see if I could peer through the slats of the fence. It wasn't the same as measuring it, but at least this way I could check and see if the dock had been built, and quickly check if there were any other new structures back there that weren't supposed to be there. After fruitlessly trying to get a good view, I resigned myself to trying to pull myself up and peer over the top of the fence. What I found there was a blank, perfectly square yard, completely level, with grass so green and low-trimmed that it looked like it belonged on a golf course. It didn't seem to make sense, being that well manicured, since I already proved there was no way for someone to get a lawnmower around back. And if the owners were willing to put that much effort into the back lawn and the fence, why was everything else so unkempt? Weirder still, the lawn was otherwise featureless. No furniture, no trees or flower beds, just a solid, blank square of grass, without even a sunspot or wild clover to be seen. It was what an AI might think a lawn looked like. Looking for the dock, though, I found that the fence even stretched across the back of the property, again with no gate. Now, this made even less sense to me. Why would anyone build a dock that they couldn't access? Why would anyone meet the markup for waterfront property only to block off their view of and access to the water? Utterly confused, I was getting ready to just call this one a failed assignment and head back to my office. But as I was heading back to my car, I looked again at the front door. Someone had to be home, right? Maybe there was some weird, esoteric way to access the dock through the fence, and maybe putting the face of a person to all this would make the experience seem less weird to me. I made for the windows. They were filthy and had ratty pink curtains drawn, but I tried my best to subtly peek through a gap and see if I could find signs of people inside. The living room of the house looked even worse than the exterior. Eggshell paint was spotted with mildew and peeling off the walls. The thin green carpet had been torn in several places, leaving it intact in some places and laying in crumpled heaps elsewhere. Light fixtures were broken or hanging limply from the ceiling, and I could not see a single piece of furniture. It was the exact opposite of what I was hoping to see in there, and with some dread, I accepted that I would try the door one more time before calling it quits. With the storm door open, I called out into the house, asking if anyone was home. No answer. I explained further who I was and what I was there to do. No answer. With my face so close to the door, I was beginning to catch whiffs of the air inside. It was sour and briny, stinking of stale seawater and the decaying detritus of low tide on a hot day. It smelled like the house had at one point been filled with seawater, then allowed to sit stagnant in there for ages. Years later, I still don't know what got into me to take a step into that house. I think I was growing concerned for the owner. What if the place had been ransacked and someone was hurt inside? What if someone couldn't get to the door or call out because they were incapacitated? Whatever the reason, I opened the screen door and took a step inside. Just one step. Enough to peek my head through the door. What immediately hit me was the intensity of the smell from before. So suffocating I almost choked on it. I quickly began to worry that someone might be dead inside, and I called out again, asking if anyone was home and if they were okay. Now, to cut away for a moment to give a bit more context. I am no stranger to supernatural experiences, even less so now than I was back then. Between seeing deceased relatives as a kid and the occasional glimpse of a stranger at a historical site, or flickering in and out of my vision, apparitions were still occasionally startling, but seldom worrying. Usually these manifest for me as seeing the vague image of a person for a short blink of time, as though watching a video and the person is only present for 1 or 2 frames, just long enough to barely register what you saw. More often, it manifests for me as a feeling, a subtle change in air pressure or an electrical quality to the air. Imagine the feeling you get when someone is right behind you. You cannot see or hear them, but their presence is somehow felt. It's like that, but in greater magnitude and more focused, usually still subtle enough to ignore it if you weren't paying attention. That was not what I felt in that house. As soon as I called out, that feeling of presence was incomparably loud and impossible not to notice, like a person bellowing for me to leave. I actually fell to my knee in surprise, my pants getting dirtied by some liquid the carpet seemed saturated with. The smell, the loudness of that presence, I felt like my breath was being pulled out of me. Then I heard a banging from somewhere above the ceiling. I thought it was footsteps at first, coming from the 2nd floor. They sounded like someone was stomping aggressively as they paced around in a circle. Or rather, the rhythm sounded wrong for footsteps and too loud. It sounded like someone was slamming something heavy repeatedly down onto the floor. I was already back at my car by the time I realized I had bolted. I've had many more paranormal experiences since then, but to this day I have never experienced that kind of deep, instinctual animal panic from them. Now, if you've been paying attention and can break this story down to its basic components, you might be wondering what I did later when I went home. Could this have just been a weird house with a squatter inside? You had a panic attack and imagined some things? Well, for months afterward, that was how I justified it to myself. Attempts to contact the owner back at the office told me that the phone number was not in service. While my boss was initially disappointed that I didn't complete the site visit, he also understood that sometimes you just can't get access and have to try again some other time. For a while after that, the weird house fell to the back of my mind. In the fall, Hurricane Sandy hit, and that meant my plate was full with all the permits sent in to repair storm damage. It was spring by the time I finally found the permit to that particular house again, dreading that I would have to go back. This time, I brought my work camera just in case, hoping to at least document my visit even if I didn't get access. But the thing is, when I drove back to the address for the 2nd time, the house was not there. To be clear, I don't mean it had been replaced with a new house. Nor do I mean that the house had been demolished, leaving an unoccupied lot at the corner of those 2 streets where it once stood. I mean it was as though the house had never been there. The 2 adjacent houses now seemingly much closer to each other, each occupying perpendicular sides of the corner. As with the first time, I compared what I saw to the blueprints, and indeed, the 2 houses were the addresses of the houses on either side of my assignment. But the house I went there to see just wasn't there, and appeared as though it never had been. Only that blueprint confirmed to me that there had been a house there. I took pictures of the unoccupied corner, returned to my boss with a shrug and the evidence of the house's non-existence, and the matter was eventually dropped while I moved on to other assignment. Ghost stories from the corporate world. Being the logical corporate world, there is hardly any space for ghost stories and theories. However, this one I can't ignore. I, 27 and male, work as an operations manager for a multi-service company. I work on the 17th floor of a massive high-rise office building in the middle of town. Most days I waste away with my spreadsheets and inventory, passing the day in front of my computer. Other days I actually visit my sites and talk to my staff. The building I am in has staff of mine in it, but only 4 of them, so I rarely see them as they are generally on the other floors hard at work. Only after 2 weeks of being with the company did I realize that 3 floors of the building have no tenants. Just 800 square meters of empty, dark rooms with thin walls and dark blue carpets. Each floor has 3 bathrooms, male, female, and handicapped, which we service only once a month if there are no tenants on the floors. All seemed normal until one day my elevator ride from my office floor to the ground was unintentionally stopped on one of the empty floors. I poked my head out of the elevator, thinking there was someone getting on, only to notice we had stopped on floor 14, the uninhabited floor. My body went cold as I stared into the empty hallway, noticing nobody around. I crept back into the elevator and looked at the buttons to see if I accidentally pressed it. Nothing. The only floor glowing was the ground floor. Strange. I pressed the close doors button, but the elevator wouldn't close. I began to panic. I stepped out of the elevator and pressed the outside button, hoping another elevator would show up. I stood quiet for a moment and watched as the elevator I had just exited started to close, and I was just not quick enough to grab the doors. There I stood alone in the dark next to the empty office and the eerie sound of the wind blowing against the building. I bolted for the fire escape stairs when I heard it. The chilling sound of a bathroom stall door closing in the female toilets. I stopped for a moment and turned to face the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar and wind was blowing through it. I was immediately horrified. You see, the door is one of those hydraulic doors that close on its own. Someone had to be holding it open from the inside. I panicked and ran out the fire escape doors, down the stairs, all the way to the ground. In a huff, I ran to security to go back up to the floor and check out the bathroom. The security thought I had gone mad, as the floor was empty, and just assumed someone from another office had come down for a more private bathroom break. We got to the floor and walked all around. Nobody in the women's bathroom, nobody in the men's. Who could it have been? I asked. Security said they would check the tapes and get back to me. What really creeped me out is that all the stall doors were locked. Maintenance hasn't unlocked them as there are no tenants. A few days passed and I'd completely forgotten about the experience. Back to my normal programming of sitting behind a desk and focusing on the logical processes of my day-to-day. On a late Friday afternoon, I got a knock on my door from 3 of the security guards asking me to confirm my story from a couple of days ago. I explained myself again and told them what I had seen, and they stared at each other in a rather weird manner. I asked them what was going on, and they explained to me the following. Nobody came to the floor. The security footage didn't catch anyone on the floor, not even me. I stood in silence. "Sir, are you sure it was floor 14? I was certain of it." Each floor has a sign. They assured me they checked each floor to see where I had popped up, but nothing. Here's where it gets more intense. There are tapes of me walking out the elevator on the ground floor, normal and mundane. I asked security to see the footage myself, and that's when I saw it. On the top right corner of the camera, facing the doors of the office on floor 14, the face of a woman. I know she's there, and she knows I exist. I have lost 17 kilograms in the last 2 months as I no longer take the elevators. I saw her doppelganger clinging on her back. When I was a kid, my parents told me that I have a third eye. Here in the Philippines, if you can see ghosts and apparitions, it means you have awakened your third eye, an eye which you use to see spirits. The reason they told me this is because I kept seeing things when I was little. My mom's grandmother, a child that was in our house, and scariest of all, my cousin's doppelganger. It was around dinner time when my cousin Sherika and I were running around the house playing. I would chase her around the house, playing tag and giggling. My mom called for us to eat dinner. I remember it was fried chicken because when I had almost finished my food, my cousin asked me if I wanted to play hide and seek. As a kid, that was my favorite game, and I agreed. I started counting while I was munching on that good-ass fried chicken, and my cousin started hiding. After counting to 10, I started my search while still holding the fried chicken in my right hand. The first room I searched was my uncle's bedroom. I looked behind the door, and luckily enough, I found her immediately. My mom and my aunt were in the kitchen conversing when I suddenly started crying and running toward them. My mom asked me what happened, and I told them that I saw a second Sherika, clinging behind my real cousin Sherika. Now, to this day, I still remember what I saw. There were 2 of my cousin Sherika behind the door. The second one was clinging on her back, peeking behind her shoulder, smiling at me. The reason I still remember this is because it was my one and only encounter with a doppelganger. And also, my mom took a photo of me holding a fried chicken while crying because she found it funny. Now, I'm not quite sure if it was really a doppelganger or a ghost disguised as my cousin, but it was still a scary encounter nonetheless since I was only 7 years old. I wish I could find that photo of me, though. Thank you for joining me for this episode of The Dreadweaver. I'll be back next week with more terrifying true tales. If you would like to submit a story of your own, head to our subreddit r/thedreadweaver, or send us an email at thedreadweaver@outlook.com. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to turn on notifications if you want to hear more. Until our paths cross again in the shadows, stay vigilant and beware the whispers of the night. This is the Dreadweaver, signing off.